This is San Francisco.
Been wanting to speak with Susan Schweik since the San Francisco government widened its so-called sit-lie regulations, making it illegal to basically rest in public, essentially a way to further criminalize homeless people. Of course, this was done by, you have the denizens of next door, you have the people that have 311 on speed dial, neighborhood associations, Neighborhood Watch. One of our least favorite neoliberals, Scott Wiener, the former supervisor from the Castro, who is now in the state senate. And of course, Scott and Mayor London Breed's pet project of putting away more homeless, disabled people and or victims of the drug war. The pet project being to lock up more people under the scheme called conservatorship, which you can learn about on a previous show in the archives. But without further ado, let me introduce Susan Schweik, who is the author of the book, The Ugly Laws. These laws criminalized people for being disabled in public in many ways.
Yeah, well, let me give a little background. I retired last year after almost 40 years as a professor at UC Berkeley. I was an English professor, but for about 25 of those years, I was very involved with the formation of the Disability Studies program. And that's how I heard about the Ugly Laws, which were a legend in the disability movement, starting from the 70s on. And so I heard them invoked very often. They were a really important symbol of state-sponsored discrimination against disabled people. And at a certain point, my coworker in disability studies, Fred Collignon, leaned over to me in a talk when someone mentioned them and said, "Were those ever enforced?" And I realized I had no idea. And I went to look up, being a good professor, and realized that there really were no resources to find out what the story was with these laws. And so I started researching them. After, I'm now writing a new book, which I feel like kind of gets at the other side of the issue. The Ugly Laws are very much about discrimination that was tied up with visibility, with visible existence, visible behavior. So I've gotten more and more interested in non-visible disability in the history of eugenics. So that's where my work is leading now.
For people who have never heard of the Ugly Laws, could you briefly describe what they were?
Yeah. First of all, they never had the word ugly in them, by the way. There's a history about how that word got attached. They were municipal ordinances that spread across the U.S. from city to city, starting from 1867 in San Francisco. San Francisco was, as far as I know, the first, until the early 20th century. They basically stopped being enacted by cities, certainly by the beginning of the First World War. The language was more or less the same, and I'll read you San Francisco's because that's our topic. It was indexed as begging, street, prohibited, penalty, and I'll say more about that maybe. And then the title of it was to prohibit street begging and to restrain certain persons from appearing in streets and public places. It started out being in its first section a straightforward begging law. No one could beg on the streets of San Francisco. And then by the time it got down to the third section, it went like this. And this was the language that swept the country. In San Francisco's version, it went like this. Any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object, or an improper person to be allowed in or on the streets, highways, thoroughfares, or public places in the city or county of San Francisco shall not therein or thereon expose himself or herself to public view. No person who is an unsightly or disgusting object shall expose themselves to public view. So that was the common language of the law.
So subjective, so vague, probably purposely so, as we'll probably get into. I would be surprised if anyone listening to this hasn't identified as, not wanting to be seen out in public because they're not feeling good about the way that they look. And so to have these really subjective laws on the books, I mean, it seems really absurd. As you mentioned in the book, they were passed under the guise of a larger effort to beautify cities and to make them more attractive to tourists and businesses. How were they actually enacted, or were they enacted?
To some extent, you could argue that they weren't. What's clear once they were enacted is that they were constantly not enforced properly. So you even get kind of subsidiary arguments about establishing laws that were essentially a version of the ugly law in order to prevent people from attempting to intervene and stop arrests, particularly of visibly disabled people on the street by police. And that happened in New York. They actually were concerned that they couldn't enforce begging law, straightforward begging law, because too many times people would rally around a person, maybe someone they knew from their neighborhood, or someone at any rate they'd passed every day on the street corner. And what got called ugly crowds would gather and try to stop the police from arresting. And this happened over and over. There were constant discussions in city councils about, we can't get the police to enact these laws. In some ways, it didn't matter because they had chilling effects. We know they did. They expressed an ethos which helped shape people. People took that in as they went. So it is true they were largely not enforced. But it's also true that they were heavily enacted and publicized when they were enacted, often in very cruel terms. In Chicago, which had the famous law, kind of accidentally, arbitrarily, Chicago became known for having this law. When the law was enacted, there was an announcement, and they talked about a specific person. They said, in the newspapers, the aldermen have done us such a big favor because they're going to get rid of that woman who plays a street organ playing the same song over and over, and her 2 children. How wonderful. They're going to rid us of her. So people were targeted in print, and enough people were targeted on the ground to eventually result in an absolutely amazing and almost completely forgotten legal treatise written by one of them who was just scared off from city to city and wrote an amazing underground sociology of his fellow so-called unsightly beggars on the street, impassioned manifesto about why these violated his constitutional rights. And he sold that on the street. And his name was Arthur Franklin Fuller, and he's the hero of my book.
I do love that your book spotlights the organizing, the direct action. There were thousands of instances of this that we'll never know. But like you said, the ugly people getting up and not allowing for their fellow ugly people to be arrested. Before we get to some of that successful direct action, you mentioned the chilling effects of these laws, how people can internalize what a law is saying about someone's own self and your legitimacy as a person within a larger social construct. Who specifically did they tend to target? And you gave this example of, people who are busking on the streets.
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, who they didn't target. I mean, they were represented in a really pure and effective way by the disability movement in the 1970s and beyond as disability discrimination. Plain disability discrimination, not quite that simple. They didn't target FDR. They didn't target Helen Keller. Unsightliness was a status offense. It was an offense by people without means. So it was tied to poverty from the start. And The most obvious intention, clearly, the most obvious function was to discourage people or prevent people from being in public space, showing visible disabilities, and asking people for money. Or, importantly, and we can talk more about this, faking disability when they ask for money. So it was part of, maybe you've talked to Claire Sears before, but if you haven't, you should. Wonderful historian of San Francisco. And she talks about problem bodies on the streets. It was part of a whole bunch of laws in San Francisco, say, just to focus on SF, that right around the same time sought to control whose bodies could be on the street, whose presence could be on the street, who could move freely. And disability wasn't the sole preoccupation of this law, but it was really central. So it's really connected in very complex ways to a lot of different dynamics. One sign of this is how it gets indexed in cities. Almost always gets indexed right in between the law against cross-dressing and the law against sex work. Completely interesting. So that tells us that it seems to have something to do with gender norms and say what gets called exposure often in municipal law, which means exposing penises, basically, maybe exposing dresses. Much later in San Francisco, Jose Sarria, who was a drag performer who might have been the first openly gay person to campaign for public office in the US, would regularly invoke the ugly law in his speeches in 1961. So they saw that connection. She saw that connection. It's tied to Jim Crow and racial segregation, whose body can be where, heavily tied to poverty. So it's related, for instance, to the California law in the Depression that prohibited Okies from being in public. There was a man who was given a 6-month sentence for driving his brother-in-law from Texas to California, simply being there. That one was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, which the unsightly beggar ordinances have never been. Very tied to immigration. The exposing a wound or a scar or an injury was often called in the US press the European method of begging, especially associated with Italy. And it was also tied to anti-Mexican hatred. So in LA, the last city I know of to debate having this law, it actually created a commission where unemployed Mexicans and unsightly beggars were going to be watched by the same board. As you said already, it's tied to appearance discrimination. And so there's a history of it being used against fat people in San Francisco. There was a court case where a woman named Jolly Trixie, who performed in sideshows, was actually brought into court and charged with the unsightly begging ordinance. And the judge says, well, I have a problem because I don't really see that she's begging. And also she has a really nicely turned ankle. But that exposes how much it's tied to appearance.
You do actually write, the ugly laws were not just about aesthetics. They were also about control. And they were a way to keep people with disabilities out of sight and out of mind. And this, I feel like there's such a parallel in today's San Francisco and in today's cities more generally, where we do have a spate of laws. Like earlier I mentioned the sit-lie laws that outlaw, sitting or lying on the sidewalk, like the so-called ugly laws, are not, widely enforced. However, they do have a chilling effect on people who are out and using public space. I wondered if you'd speak a little bit to how, you see the vestiges of the ugly laws continue to show up in the U.S. today.
Very much. And I'm so glad to hear you putting this history in that context, because as helpful as it was for disability movement activists to remember and foreground this law, and really we only know about it because of disability activism, it isn't, I don't think, even the primary or most important connection to be made to the present. Although, disabled people were always under the threat of this law. And one thing I'll say about the way the laws originated is when I was researching them, one thing I realized very quickly was if I could find when a city opened its first almshouse, its first poorhouse, the ugly law would be likely to follow, because there was a place for people to be shut in, for people to be sequestered, and it could seem as if it were beneficence, charity, organized charity, properly organized and disciplined charity, socially engineered charity, and so that produced it. In terms of the history today, sit-lie law is so important. If not enforced by police action, enforced by really insidious other ways. So sometimes it's pretty overt today now. I was talking to somebody the other day about Donald Trump and how one of Trump's fairly early forays into politics is just a direct grandchild of ugly law. In 1991, he went on a campaign. He wrote to the New York Daily News and other places saying he was opposing permits that allowed disabled veterans, Vietnam veterans, to have food carts near the Metropolitan Museum of Art or places like that. And he writes his letter and he says, do we allow Fifth Avenue, one of the world's most luxurious shopping districts, to be downgraded by these disabled people selling things on the streets? They tried to get rid of them. So sometimes it's really overt. Serious connection is to the whole history of faking. Very commonly, when people objected, it was disturbing to see people being arrested who were obviously down and out and at the time could not work, right? Would not be hired. There were no accommodations. There was no sense of that. So it was distressing for many people in the public to see it. And so then the argument that got created is they're not really blind or they don't really have an amputated limb. They're not really paralyzed. They're faking it. Right. And in fact, there were fakers. There were entire cultures of fakers, often led and taught by disabled ringleaders, and who would pool their resources. And they'd have bars that had names like the Doctors and the Cripples Home. And it drove, and that in San Francisco, that happened. There were fakers, but much more importantly, there were not fakers who were accused of being fakers. And that's connected to all kinds of things today. The way people are denied benefits and services because they're thought to be what Bill Hughes calls counterfeit citizens. The studies that show the tiny percentage of people who are actually fraudulent in applying for benefits, but the large percentage that the public guesses are. So faking, the politics of faking and accusation of faking is really connected to this law. There are lots of city management plans, sit-lie being one of them, and they're not laws. They come in a much more insidious and cunning fashion. They're plans. They're just like, oh, we'll do a better job of managing our city. So we'll make this rule that says you have to have a 6-foot right of way on the sidewalk. And this is an especially insidious thing, I think. The Americans with Disabilities Act is used as a way to justify these plans. Like, look, people are being blocked from being able to move down the street in wheelchairs by people lying on the street or begging or living on the street or whatever. And it's what the great late disability justice activist Stacey Milburn called access washing. And my own hometown, Berkeley, created a version of that plan. A lot of it happens privately too. It's not done by municipal law. It's done by a mall owner or a building owner, simply putting up signs that says, you can't beg here or whatever. So there are many ways in neoliberal society where these things can be accomplished without law at all, and probably much more effectively. And there's one going right now in Sacramento, 2 disabled people who are suing the city for violating the Americans with Disabilities Act because there are encampments of unhoused people who are taking up space and blocking. And, people need thoroughfares. But what's so incredible about this is that the people who are being kicked to the curb, whether self-identified or not, a high number of those people we would identify under the ADA as disabled.
Absolutely. I think that this idea of access washing, this is an important thing that I think anyone who wants to be literate in how neoliberal policies can work definitely will post some resources in the show notes about access washing. I wanted to speak a little bit about the local. You mentioned the work of Claire Sears and the drag performers like Jose Sarria, who experienced being on like the receiving end of the ugly laws, and the existence of San Francisco as sort of like a forward-thinking capital of issues around gender and queerness. I know that we have a reputation for, we're this gay capital, and the Castro is this huge gayborhood that every other gayborhood should aspire to. But of course, we, have plenty of pushback against progress towards, widening definitions around gender and how you can express gender in public. And I was wondering if you could speak to, was there anything in particular about the Bay Area or San Francisco at the time that it became famously the first place to enact an ugly law? Was there something locally that made it kind of like the fertile ground for the introduction of the ugly laws?
Yeah, I think so. I love hearing you say that it's famously the origin point, because I still read all the time discussions of the law that pin it on Chicago. And that is just sheer accident. It's because Chicago was the place where disability activists first went to the city council and tried to cancel the law. So smeared their city by, rightly so. I mean, Chicago had the law. But I was amazed after years of researching this law to discover it right here in my own backyard and realize I think it was the first. We actually don't know, but it's the first that I found. And yeah, I think there were some reasons why it happened so early here. This isn't a reason, but so many things. California is such fertile ground for the introduction of modernity. So many things have begun in California and then swept out. San Francisco in particular. So some of the things I've thought about, like why would it have started here? And so much earlier than any other law I found. The next one I found was in Portland, also West Coast, but good 20 years later. Why here? Obviously, because the language is identical, somebody at a certain point seizes on that law and takes it to whatever the next city was, very possibly Portland. But why here? It was definitely a city in urban shock, and I think that is a prerequisite for this law. When people know each other by face and name, this law isn't needed. There's some other way in which they manage whatever the problems are that it's attempting to resolve. But some of the forms of shock. San Francisco, 1867, is in the aftermath of the gold rush and the boom and the bust. And there are many, many, many people being identified, usually described with words like insane or wrecks. They're wrecks, W-R-E-C-K-S, all over the streets of San Francisco. People who came out for the gold rush and were hurt, physically hurt, psychically hurt, and then never left and have nowhere to go and no safety net. San Francisco is experiencing early, massive multinational migration, especially Chinese immigration. And is trying to manage that. Just the ongoing reverberations of the U.S. annexation of this place from Mexico. That was only 20 years before that. So all these people have been hurt by gold rushing and can't get out. And then at the same time, this ideology, gold rush ideology of self-made success and just pick yourself up and make your way. So I think in a harsh place, especially harsh place. And then not least the Civil War. So 1867, it's just slightly after the Civil War. And what's interesting about that is it's very near in time, but far from the battleground. So unlike places, say, in the South, where there are just way too many diseased, maimed, deformed, injured, traumatized people everywhere. And I think that it would have been less likely to see this kind of law then because the whole society is kind of reeling together. But San Francisco was a little bit removed. And that meant also that there could be suspicion of fakers in San Francisco. And then finally, as I said, the main predictor of these laws emerging is a certain kind of attitude about charity. The Charity Organization Society was organizing. That really was the predecessor of sociology and of social work. And the idea was, rather than giving what they called indiscriminate soup, they would have very carefully bureaucratized and scrutinized handouts to people. White abolitionists had come back up from the South, and where they were watching municipal law, vagrancy law, brutally, efficiently being organized to do all the same work that slavery had done in new form. And they learned from that, and they brought it north to apply it to poor people in cities that were getting scary. And San Francisco had charity organization, and it had an almshouse. And that almshouse is now the site of Laguna Honda, the big, notorious, gigantic warehouse nursing home in San Francisco, hospital.
You mentioned how San Francisco is the ground zero for a lot of policies. We are a huge exporter of not just, tech, but policy is a huge export for us. I think it's interesting also to go back in the conversation to how this became a point for people to organize around this particular policy. And in the book, you do speak a lot to how people came together and planned direct actions and organized to eventually end these laws. Could you speak about who all was involved with this pushback?
Yeah, well, there were pushbacks all along, often spontaneous, just pushbacks from the ugly crowds. There were a few organized efforts, but people were so marginalized and so vulnerable. People begging on the street, disabled people begging on the street, that it was very difficult. You can see in Arthur Franklin Fuller's incredible books, and this is the one chapter of my book that I would really recommend where I talk about Fuller. You can see various ways in which people are pushing back individually or in groups. There was an amazing union of disabled people begging on the street in LA. They formed a union. They act just like a union. They go and talk to the mayor, and they use union style methods. But really, it began to really take off in the 1970s. In Omaha, very late, decades after really this law had been enforced, somebody was arrested under the ugly law. And he was we would call him unhoused now. He was on the street. Policemen couldn't figure out how to arrest him. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't disorderly. Policemen really wanted to arrest him. So he goes and combs the Omaha law books. And as in many cities, including to this day, that law is just sitting there. And he says, well, look, that guy has a scar on his face, so it looks unsightly to me, so I'll arrest him. Guy gets in court. The judge is incredulous. I interviewed the judge about this case. Judge was 100 years old when I interviewed him. The judge was great. The judge said, well, does this mean if my neighbor's ugly-looking kids ask me for something, I'm supposed to arrest them? And a headline in the Omaha paper said, begging law punishes only the ugly. That's where the ugly comes from that heading. Bunch of lawyers who are beginning to do disability rights work, including Robert Bergdorf, who was the drafter of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Some of them are in Chicago, some of them are in Omaha. They're working on trying to begin to create legislation that eventually would become the Americans with Disabilities Act. And they tell each other about the Omaha people say, wow, look at this. And it's so important to them because it is a provable example of state discrimination on the basis of disability. That is how they understand it. That is how they work with it. That is how they run with it. And so out of that came the Chicago group that decided to call attention to it by petitioning their city council to revoke the law still on the books. And Mike Royko, the incredible journalist in Chicago, writes this amazing op-ed where he says, hey, I think this is a great law. I think Spiro Agnew should be arrested under this law. And so he's supportive, but in this ironic way. And at that point, it became available for the disability rights movement. So in organizing around Section 504, the organizing we see represented in the documentary Crip Camp now, in the follow-up organizing from 504 for the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ugly law was incredibly useful because it could be said that the government had actively discriminated against disabled people. And so that's how it became associated specifically with disabled people. And it's a really important choice of a symbol. It worked in many ways.
I love that, story of people taking what were just this really obscene way of further marginalizing people who are already, just so marginalized generally, and using that point to organize around. And it's not the only case, of course, where that happens, where organizers see something that's really ugly, like the ugly laws. I bet you got a lot of puns as you were promoting this book back in the day. The end of the ugly laws came about because people saw them as a really great point to organize around.
Yeah, that's what Robert Bergdorf said to me when I interviewed him. I said, why'd you call it the ugly laws? There's no ugly in the language. And he said, I thought those laws were hideously ugly. What's interesting to me about this as eugenics, the same thing, is that intersectionality is so profoundly gotten at through these histories because they targeted so many things all at once. That's why they took off, because they could so brilliantly attack so many things that were fearsome to the dominant and normative culture. And at the same time, they allow for the possibility of really skillful, deep, profound, intersectional opposition.
Thank you so much, Susan, for joining us here in San Francisco. Are there any projects that you're working on right now that you might want to plug?
I'm working on another book, almost done. It's called Unfixed. And then the long subtitle is How the Women of Glenwood Asylum Overturned Ideas About IQ and Why You Don't Know About Them. And it is a book about the history of eugenics that centers a group of institutionalized people who were the targets of eugenics and shows the work they did to challenge it.
Really looking forward to that one, and I hope that you'll consider coming back on to speak about it.
I would love to.
Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco, where there are 20 empty homes for every person who is homeless. The show is produced by Toshio Moronic and Caitlin Wood. I have a book coming out that you can pre-order now. It's called Miss Major Speaks, Conversations with a Black Trans Revolutionary. Available anywhere you can get a book. Please go to patreon.com/Sad Francisco to help support the show. See you next time in Sad Francisco.